recently our abbess was telling the community how important the Lam Rim teachings are, as well as the mind training teachings. And I wanted to talk about the Lam Rim a little bit today. We have this one-page handout that Venerable Chodron made years ago that I really like. And I'll introduce a little bit, but I want to talk about a specific aspect of it. This is an overview of the path to enlightenment, and we'll make a link to it in this for you. And what it does is it kind of takes the whole path and puts it on one page, which is remarkable. And then it splits it up in different ways, like the initial scope, the middle scope, and the advanced scope of practitioner. But it also puts in there the three principal aspects of the path. And it's all, so you have it kind of three areas, the three scopes. And then, but what I want to talk about is this other part of it, which is how it shows you that there are these certain aspirations that we want to have in each of these scopes, and how to go about it. And you just touched on it briefly this weekend, but didn't say too much. And I don't hear this said enough for me. So I thought I'd talk about this. You know, we want to develop a certain aspiration, but we actually have to create the causes to have that aspiration. And so this sheet tells you, like, if you want to have a certain aspiration of the scope, here's what you do to develop that. And then another set of causes that you need to create to actually actualize that aspiration. So that's a really, I think, important kind of concept to have in our mind, like as we're entering Buddhist study, wherever we are, like we have to create causes, but that's kind of vague. This is like the roadmap, actually, of how we can go about this. And so I thought I would talk mostly, and just to back up a little bit, Lama Tsongkhapa, when he talks about the Lam Rim, which is, of course, he based his work on Atisha's lamp to the path to awakening. He describes it as a kind of an oral teaching that contains the scriptures of the whole canon and commentaries and various instructions that were all put together in one graded path. So that's an amazing thing to think that the whole scope of the path is laid out that way. When you first come across like the middle length discourses, you just see the Buddha talking to this person, talking to that person, talking to that person, and it's hard to figure out, like, well, what do I do? I spent the first 3 years of becoming a more serious Buddhist of trying to figure out where is the beginning of this path. That question I had in my mind for about 3 years. And then once we learned about the Lam Rim, you know, and the greatness of the Lam Rim teachings, everything becomes more clear. So I find this to be kind of an important topic. So, yeah, where's the beginning? Where's the middle? Where's the end? And where are you at any time? And what is the overview? So that's all on this one piece of paper for how the Lam Rim is laid out. And in that, I was going to talk today about the first level of this, the initial practice, just to kind of say, like you see on the piece of paper there, like this aspiration to have a peaceful death and also to have a good rebirth. How do you make that your aspiration? I don't just walk into this building and as a new person and have that as an aspiration. That's not where I'm at. And still I have to work on that because I'm very bound to this life, right? So to develop that aspiration, we actually meditate on precious human life, impermanence, and death in the unfortunate realms of rebirth, as it says in that one little box there, right? So that's what I thought I would talk about a little bit today as this first level. So if you think about it, when we study a precious human life, we're actually getting an idea of kind of our potential, but also an appreciation of our life so that we can make use of it in the sense of, wow, we have this situation, or maybe we don't have all of it and we need to create this situation. So that's important to have. And then also to think about impermanence. You know, we don't wake up every day just thinking we're going to die unless we actually put our mind on the topic. It doesn't usually come to mind. One of the problems that we have is we have these four distortions that we carry with us. One of them is this idea of permanence, and it just kind of gets in the way of our actually practicing even the first scope, as do the other those four distortions, thinking what is unattractive to be attractive, what is unsatisfactory or in the nature of dukkha to be pleasurable, what is impermanent to be permanent, and what is selfless to have a self. These actually these are things that impede our ability to take advantage of our precious human life. So if you just think about this one about impermanence and death, since we don't think about that, and I've heard so many stories of this, and Lama Tsongkhapa says, we say, I won't die today, I won't die today, I won't die today. And even if we're not consciously thinking it, it's kind of like our default. We aren't thinking that we're going to die today. You have to actually bring it to mind. And what if you never bring that to mind? Then actually you may not make the best use of this precious human life. And you hear stories of people who, even the day, they're in hospice, and the day that they actually do die, they wake up that morning and they still don't think I'm going to die that day. It's just, this is the thing about permanence. So we work on this to have this attitude so that we recognize that we need to make use of our life. And then if we don't do that, then we'll just kind of stay in the day-to-day. We might even stay on autopilot. We might not even necessarily practice any kind of spiritual path because you may not see a need for it at that level. So, let's see. So at the initial scope, then we want to get a little more clarity about our precious human life and what it can do for us. And impermanence and death and the unfortunate realms, the fact that even if we don't know too much about these different realms, we see the life of animals, we see our own suffering, and we don't want to suffer. So knowing that there's a way to alleviate some of that, and especially if you think about having regret at the time of death, the initial scope of practices can actually help a person to not have any regrets at the time of death. So that's like right there, a huge benefit, just at this first level, the way we're looking at it. So then once you have a notion of that maybe I do want to think about dying peacefully, and maybe I do want to think about what happens afterwards, and you want those to be good results, then what do? Well, you have the aspiration. Now you need to do the practices that assure the results. So this is where refuge and karma and its effects come in. So this is something that we do over a long period of time. Refuge is something that we learn about, but we actually deepen over, I would think it must be our whole practice all the way to full awakening. So I'm glad you're nodding, because it kind of makes sense to me that would never end. I remember you asked Geshe Tekchok once, when do you not need a teacher? And he said, not till you get to full awakening. So obviously then we probably need to be taking refuge still too. So, yeah. So we do, the refuge is what kind of opens the door to the Dharma for us. They say sometimes until you've taken refuge, you're just maybe studying Dharma, but you're actually not practicing it. I've heard that expression before. Refuge opens the door to these practices. Then the second thing is thinking about karma and its effects. We have to develop a kind of faith, a kind of conviction that our happiness, both temporary and long-term, relates to our actions, our virtuous and non-virtuous actions. And I think, Geshe, years and years ago, I'm sure it was I don't know, when these books first came out by Geshe Sopa and the Lam Rim, I read this quote, and I reread it again today, and it speaks to me just as clearly. What he says about this is, naturally, once you've learned that there's so much suffering in the three lower realms, or for me, I would say just the suffering I'm aware of in this life and not wanting it, but especially when you think about what's going to happen after you die, then you'll become motivated to prevent an unfortunate rebirth. That's just natural. So the person who has the initial scope, level of capacity, it's actually the fear of misery, this fear of dukkha, that is the primary motivation to follow the path, is what he says. I would say that's true for me. And so then what do you do Well, the most important thing then is to take refuge, have a reliable guide, have a reliable solution that you can, that will lead you out of this situation. And then what he says is that's where you start. And this allows you to enter deeply into the teachings of the Buddha. But then the next step is to examine causality. I remember he also says around that time in this book that we don't know it. We're like a freshman on a college campus. We've just come out of the lower realms and ended up in this realm, and we kind of don't know what to do, right? So we need to take refuge, and we need to examine causality. This is the big task, making examples from your own experience until you're convinced that positive actions result in happiness and negative actions or destructive actions lead to unhappiness. We have to convince ourselves of that. You have to have this strong trust in the relationship of cause and effect in this way. It's the basis for living a life of virtue and for engaging in spiritual training. And then he goes on to say that, to avoid misery and to attain happiness, you have to create the causes, right? Just what we're talking about here, practicing virtue, avoiding non-virtue. But then he goes on, and he's now speaking, this is the oral transmission. It's not so easy to do this. It takes a lot of mental and physical effort. And so if you don't have confidence, this is where he ties together the refuge and the karma. If you don't have confidence in the truth of the path and the benefit, you probably aren't going to get too far, because you need to have, this is where faith is needed as well as wisdom. You have to have this in order to make the effort. You won't change your attitude or your behaviors unless you have this. So that's why we have to examine karmic causality, which is the root of all happiness, from worldly joys up to all the way to liberation and enlightenment, full awakening. So that's the first scope, all in this little box that takes that much room on this piece of paper. So I think I printed some out for people who aren't familiar with it, but also because it's nice to have on your puja table, just to kind of, it's one glance meditation in a certain way.